Emma Carter had always been quiet. She moved through her college campus like a shadow, never calling attention to herself. Seattle's winter mornings were foggy and damp, and she liked it that way. It suited her mood, her nature. She was 22, soft-spoken, and often underestimated by everyone around her. Emma had a gentle presence, the kind of innocence that made people want to protect her. Though she didn't realize she carried a quiet strength within herself, she liked to sketch, mostly in private, capturing the world as she saw its small details. Unnoticed expressions, subtle movements, but she never thought of herself as an artist. Not really. Art, to her, was a private refuge, a safe place where no one could see. How uncertain she felt in life. It was during her final semester that she decided to take an art elective. A small class in painting, mostly because her advisor suggested it might help with her creative thinking. She didn't expect much. Certainly didn't expect to meet Professor Adrian Hayes. Adrian was a well-known figure on campus. A man in his mid-30s with a calm presence and a reputation for creating emotionally powerful paintings. Students often spoke about him with reverence. He wasn't flashy or loud, but there was something magnetic about the way he carried himself. He had deep brown eyes that seemed to study every detail, every imperfection, and somehow make them feel perfect. He had a gentle, thoughtful voice, the kind that could make ordinary words feel important. Emma wasn't looking for inspiration when she entered his studio on the first day of class. She was simply hoping to survive the semester with a passing grade. But the moment Adrian glanced at her first sketch, something shifted. He didn't critique her technique in a harsh way. He didn't make her feel inadequate, which she had grown used to in the past. Instead, he looked at her drawing like he could see straight into her thoughts. "You draw like someone who has something to say," he said softly. Emma froze. No one had ever said something like that to her before. No one had ever noticed her in that way, as if the layers she hid behind could be seen by someone else without words. Her heart skipped a beat, a quiet flutter she tried to ignore. She mumbled a thank you, unsure what to say, but inside she felt a spark. For the first time, someone seemed to see her, really see her, and it frightened her as much as it thrilled her. From that day on, she found herself lingering after class more often than necessary. She asked questions about technique, about color, about perspective, questions that sometimes had nothing to do with the assignment and everything to do with being near him. Listening to him explain his thoughts, watching his hands move across a canvas as he demonstrated brushstrokes. Adrian never forced conversation, never overstepped boundaries. But the way he spoke about art, about emotion, about the human experience, captivated her. He made her feel like her feelings were valid, that they belonged somewhere outside of her notebooks and private sketches. Each class with him was like a gentle brushstroke on a canvas. She didn't know she was painting inside herself. It wasn't just his skill or knowledge that drew her in. It was the way he noticed the little things. He saw when she hesitated, when she added too much shadow, when her eyes lingered on a certain corner of the canvas. And instead of criticism, he offered guidance, subtle suggestions that made her feel capable rather than judged. Emma had never felt so encouraged. In past experiences, teachers had always focused on flaws, making her doubt herself at every turn. But Adrian seemed to know that true artistry came from feeling, not perfection. He had a rare ability to make his students feel safe enough to reveal themselves, without forcing them to do so. Her feelings began to shift without her noticing. She looked forward to class more than anything else in her week. The studio became a sanctuary, a place where she could let her guard down. She found herself thinking about him outside class, wondering how he would critique her latest sketch, wondering if he would notice the slight improvement she had made. She told herself it was just admiration for his talent, a student appreciating her teacher. But deep down, she knew it was more. Her heart beat faster when he spoke to her, and she felt a strange mixture of warmth and vulnerability in his presence. She was aware of every detail, the sound of his voice, the way his eyes lingered on the smallest nuances of her work, the calm authority in his posture. One afternoon, while Emma stayed late in the studio working on a new painting, Adrian approached quietly, as if he had always been part of the room. He didn't speak immediately. He simply watched her for a moment, his eyes following the movements of her brush. Then he said softly, almost like a whisper, "You have something inside you that's worth sharing." Emma's breath caught. She put down her brush, trying to find words, but couldn't. She had never heard anyone speak about her inner world with such clarity. It was terrifying to be seen so deeply, but it was also intoxicating. She wanted to reach out, to ask him to explain, to stay longer, but she d-a-den single quotes. Adrian noticed her hesitation. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to understand everything she was feeling without judgment. "Your art doesn't need to be perfect," he said. "It needs to be honest. That's the only thing that matters." That moment stayed with her long after she left the studio. On the way home, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her work. The tone of his voice, the quiet encouragement that made her feel seen. She realized she was starting to care more about his opinion than anyone else's. She didn't fully understand why, but the thought made her heart race. Over the next few weeks, Emma found herself staying later and later in the studio. She asked for advice on her sketches, experiments with color, and techniques she had never dared try. Adrian offered his guidance patiently, never rushing her, never judging her mistakes. Each interaction built a quiet bond between them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emma could feel it growing. There was a comfort in his presence, a reassurance that no one else had ever offered her. He respected her space, but also gently challenged her, pushing her to explore parts of herself she had never allowed to exist, despite the closeness she felt. Emma carried a tension inside her. She began to wonder if she was reading too much into their interactions, if she was imagining the depth of the connection. She reminded herself constantly that he was her professor, that boundaries existed, and that any emotional attachment was dangerous and inappropriate. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation she felt whenever she approached the studio. The subtle longing that arose when she saw him focus on her work. It was a delicate balance of admiration, respect, and something more that she didn't fully understand. One rainy evening, Emma was alone in the studio finishing a sketch she had been struggling with for weeks. Adrian entered quietly, his presence filling the space without a word. He observed her work, making soft comments about technique, but also noting the emotional depth in her lines. "You're discovering your own voice," he said. Emma felt a surge of pride and something else, something tender and unexpected. She realized that he had witnessed her growth, her transformation from a timid student to someone willing to take risks with her art. The recognition was exhilarating, but it also left her vulnerable. She didn't know how to navigate the feelings that were emerging. That evening, as Adrian left, he paused by the door. "Keep trusting yourself," he said softly. His words lingered long after he had gone, echoing in the quiet studio. Emma stayed behind, staring at her unfinished sketch, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. She understood that her life was changing in ways she couldn't yet articulate. She was becoming more aware of herself, of her desires, of her potential. And she knew that Professor Adrian Hayes had become the catalyst for something she hadn't expected, something that went beyond art by the end of the semester. Emma's confidence had grown, though so had the complexity of her emotions. She was drawn to Adrian in a way that scared her, a way that was entirely new. The studio had become a place of discovery, not just of artistic talent, but of emotional depth and human connection. She felt her innocence and quiet strength intertwining, forming something richer, more nuanced. She didn't yet know where this path would lead, but she sensed that her life would never be the same. Every brushstroke, every whispered comment, every moment spent under his guidance had begun to shape her not just as an artist, but as a person. Emma left the studio one last time before winter break, carrying her sketchbook close to her chest. She walked through the foggy streets of Seattle, feeling the chill in the air, but also a warmth inside her that had nothing to do with the season. She realized she was standing at the edge of a new chapter, one that was as fragile as it was exhilarating. And deep inside, she knew that Professor Adrian Hayes had done more than teach her art. He had begun to transform her. stroke by stroke, from a timid, hidden soul into someone ready to be seen, ready to feel, ready to become. Emma Carter had been carrying the quiet tension of her feelings for weeks. The closer she grew to Professor Adrian Hayes, the more she realized how much she wanted to be near him, not just as a student, but in some way she didn't yet have words for. Winter had settled over Seattle, turning the streets foggy and soft, giving the city a muted, almost magical glow. The rain tapped gently on the studio windows as Emma stayed late, painting a portrait she had been struggling with for days. She wasn't thinking about grades or assignments anymore. She was thinking about expression, about emotion, about capturing a part of herself she hadn't known existed until Adrian's guidance had drawn it out. Adrian entered the studio quietly, his presence familiar, yet still causing her pulse to quicken. He moved with calm confidence, his eyes scanning the room, lingering briefly on her work. He never imposed his presence, but somehow his simple act of being there made the space feel different. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the awareness of how much his attention mattered to her. She tried to focus on her brushstrokes, on the subtle mix of colors, but her hand trembled slightly. She wondered if he noticed. She wondered if he felt anything similar. She tried to push the thought away. He was her professor. He was someone she respected deeply. These feelings were hers alone to navigate. Delicate and unspoken. "You're improving faster than I expected," Adrian said softly, walking around her canvas. His words were gentle, but they carried weight, a quiet acknowledgement of her growth. Emma swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Compliments had never unsettled her like this before. She wanted to speak, to tell him how much his guidance had meant, but her voice caught in her throat. She nodded instead, forcing a small smile. She hoped he didn't notice the subtle quiver in her hands, the way her heart seemed to beat a little too fast for a normal conversation. The studio was quiet, except for the faint scratching of her brush against the canvas. Emma felt Adrian's gaze on her, warm and observant. There was no judgment in it, only attention, understanding, and perhaps curiosity. "Emma," he said after a long pause, "your work is starting to feel alive. You're letting yourself be seen. That's rare." She froze for a moment, her brush hovering in the air. He had never said anything like that. Not about her, not about her art. There was an intensity in his words that made her chest ache. It wasn't a physical ache, but a deep emotional flutter she couldn't ignore. She wanted to speak, but the words dissolved before they reached her lips. Adrian noticed her hesitation and smiled faintly. A soft, knowing smile that didn't cross any boundaries, but seemed to understand her completely. "You don't have to rush," he said quietly. "Art isn't about speed. It's about truth." His voice was steady, calm, but it carried an intimacy she wasn't used to. She felt exposed in a way that was thrilling and terrifying all at once. For weeks, she had been learning how to express herself through paint. But now she realized she was learning how to express herself in front of him, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Days passed, and the connection between them deepened without ever being spoken aloud. Emma found herself staying later in the studio more often, lingering under the pretext of finishing assignments. She asked questions she didn't always need answers for, just to hear his voice, to watch his hands demonstrate technique, to feel the quiet presence of someone who understood her. She began to notice subtle details about him, the way he would tilt his head slightly when analyzing a color, the faint smile when a student surprised him with creativity, the careful way he chose words that encouraged rather than criticized. Every observation added layers to her admiration, and slowly admiration began to blend with something more. Something she didn't dare define yet. One evening, the studio was almost empty. Most students had left, and the rain outside had created a soft, rhythmic background. Emma was working on a larger canvas, painting a figure in muted tones with hesitant brushstrokes. Adrian moved behind her, silent and patient, observing without interrupting. "You're exploring emotion in a way you didn't before," he said finally. "You're brave enough to put yourself into the work." His words landed softly, like a touch she could feel in her chest. She turned slightly to meet his eyes, and for a fleeting second, the world outside the studio seemed to disappear. It was only her, him, and the quiet intimacy of shared understanding. Emma's breath caught. She wanted to ask him why he saw things in her that no one else did, but the question felt dangerous. Instead, she whispered, I don't know if I can do it justice. Adrian's gaze softened. You don't have to know right now. You just need to feel it. He didn't reach out, didn't cross any boundary, but the intensity of the moment made Emma's heart race. She felt a warmth she couldn't ignore, a sense of connection that transcended teacher and student. Though neither dared acknowledge it, that evening marked a turning point. Emma realized that her feelings were growing beyond admiration and respect. She was drawn to him in ways that were complicated, subtle, and emotionally powerful. She began to notice the small interactions, the way he lingered near her work a moment longer than necessary, the way his comments felt layered with more than just artistic critique. She felt herself longing for those moments, anticipating his presence, craving the quiet attention he gave her. It was exhilarating and terrifying. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling both fear and the thrill of possibility. Adrian, for his part, remained professional in appearance, careful not to overstep. Yet there was a gentleness in his actions that betrayed his own awareness of their growing connection. He encouraged her, guided her, and sometimes allowed moments of silence that felt charged with unspoken emotion. Emma found herself analyzing every gesture, every tone of his voice, wondering what it meant, what it revealed, what he felt about her. She questioned herself constantly. Was she reading too much into this? Was it possible that he didn't feel the same way? The uncertainty made every interaction more intense, more magnetic, and more difficult to ignore despite the tension. Emma continued to pour herself into her art. She experimented with color, composition, and emotional depth in ways she never had before. Every stroke of her brush felt like a step toward understanding herself, her feelings, and the unspoken connection she shared with Adrian. She started keeping a journal of sketches, notes, and ideas, capturing not just her artistic progress, but the emotional journey that accompanied it. Her sketches became more expressive, more daring, reflecting the internal awakening she felt under Adrian's guidance. One particularly rainy afternoon, Emma was alone in the studio putting the final touches on a self-portrait that captured her uncertainty and hope. Adrian entered quietly, pausing at the doorway. He didn't need to speak for the room to feel charged with his presence. Your work has changed, he said softly, moving closer to examine the canvas. You're showing parts of yourself now that you didn't before. That takes courage. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the acknowledgement of her growth, her emotional exposure, and the subtle bond they had formed. She wanted to speak, to tell him how much his presence had affected her. But the words faltered. Instead, she nodded, trying to steady her hands and her voice. I'm learning, she admitted quietly. Adrian's eyes softened, and he gave a small, encouraging smile. And that's all anyone can ask for. He replied. The room was silent for a moment, the sound of rain outside blending with the quiet hum of the studio. The intensity of the moment left Emma feeling both exhilarated and vulnerable. She understood now that her feelings were no longer just admiration. They were something deeper, something emotional and complex. Something she didn't yet have the courage to define. Over the next few weeks, Emma's emotional landscape continued to shift. She became more aware of the subtle pull she felt toward Adrian, the longing that lingered after every conversation. Every critique, every moment of quiet attention. She noticed the way her chest lifted when he smiled at her work. The way her hands trembled when he spoke directly to her about technique or expression. She questioned herself constantly, wondering if she was reading too much into innocent guidance, if her heart was being deceived by the intensity of mentorship. And yet, despite the questions and the uncertainty, she couldn't deny the feelings that had begun to take root. Adrian, too, seemed aware of the delicate tension in the room. He maintained his professionalism, never overstepping boundaries. Yet there was a gentleness and attentiveness in his guidance that revealed his understanding of her emotional state. He offered critiques that were precise but kind, encouraged experimentation, and created an environment where Emma felt safe to explore both her art and herself. Every interaction became layered with unspoken emotion, and Emma found herself anticipating these moments, cherishing them, and fearing them in equal measure by the end of part 2. Emma realized that her journey with Adrian was no longer just about art. It had become a journey of self-discovery, emotional awakening, and the quiet thrill of connection. She was learning to trust herself, to embrace her feelings, and to navigate the complexities of admiration, attraction, and respect. The studio had become a sanctuary, not just for her art. The end of the semester was approaching, and Emma Carter felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The campus was quieter now, the winter air soft and damp, and the streets glowed under the haze of streetlights reflecting on wet pavement. Finals week brought more than just exams. It brought the announcement of a small student gallery where everyone could display their work. Emma wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that her final piece was more than just a requirement. It was a reflection of everything she had discovered about herself over the past months. Every lesson, every critique, every late afternoon spent with Professor Adrian Hayes had left its mark on her art. And on her heart, she spent hours in the studio preparing her final canvas. It was a portrait, delicate in its lines, soft in its colors, capturing the quiet strength and cautious hope she had discovered within herself. As she worked, she thought of Adrian, of the way he had guided her hand without ever touching it, of the way he saw things she had never dared to show anyone. She wasn't painting him, not directly, but every brushstroke carried the essence of the connection she had felt, the unspoken bond that had grown between them. She feared the emotions she was uncovering. They were deep, tender, and complicated. She reminded herself that he was her professor, a boundary she could not cross. And yet, in the privacy of her work, she allowed herself to explore the feelings that had blossomed quietly in her heart. The night of the gallery arrived, and Emma's nerves were tight as she walked through the softly lit hall filled with student paintings. The air smelled faintly of varnish and polish, a combination that reminded her of long hours in the studio. Guests wandered slowly, admiring the work on display, and Emma felt her anxiety spike as she looked at her own painting. It was personal, almost like a diary entry on canvas. She hoped no one would see too much of her inner world. And yet, a part of her hoped that someone Adrian would. And then she saw him. Adrian Hayes moved quietly through the crowd, his presence calm and steady, drawing her gaze immediately. He didn't make a scene. He didn't announce himself. He simply existed in the space, carrying the same quiet authority that had captivated her in the studio. When he approached her, Emma's breath caught. He smiled faintly, not at her painting alone, but at her. "You've done well," he said softly. His words, simple as they were, carried weight beyond the critique. They acknowledged the journey she had undertaken, the courage she had shown, and the growth that had emerged from months of guidance. Emma nodded, feeling her hands tremble slightly. I wasn't sure anyone would understand it," she admitted. Adrian's gaze softened, and he tilted his head, studying her as though he could see through the layers she'd carefully built around herself. "I do," he said simply. And just like that, the moment stretched heavy with unspoken meaning, an intimacy that was gentle yet profound. Emma felt the warmth of his attention, the quiet depth of his acknowledgement, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to breathe freely. Then, as if sensing that she needed something more, Adrian gestured toward a covered painting in the corner of the room. "I have something I wasn't planning to show tonight," he said, "but I think it's time." Emma felt her heart skip. She hadn't expected this, not in any way. She followed him, curiosity and nervous anticipation building with each step. He pulled the cloth away, revealing a painting that immediately drew her breath. It was a figure standing in soft light, painted with gentle strokes that captured emotion rather than detail. The features were subtle but unmistakably familiar. Emma's eyes widened as she realized this was her. Not a literal portrait, but a reflection of her essence, her quiet strength, her cautious hope, the innocence that had slowly become courage. She looked at Adrian, her voice barely a whisper. "You painted me." Adrian's expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed emotion. "Not just you," he said quietly. "Your presence, your growth. You've changed the way I see art, the way I feel about it, and the way I see the world." His voice was steady, controlled, but the warmth in it made Emma's chest tighten. She realized that the months of guidance, of mentorship, of subtle connection had culminated in this single, intimate act. He had painted her not because it was required, but because she had inspired him. Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. A mix of awe, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of being truly seen. For years she had hidden parts of herself, blending into the background, afraid that her quiet nature would be overlooked. And yet here was a man, her professor, her mentor, who had captured not just her image, but her inner world, in a way that was both respectful and deeply personal. She realized that the boundaries she had feared were real, but they didn't diminish the emotional significance of this moment. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. Her heart was pounding, not in fear, but in recognition of the profound connection they shared. Adrian stepped closer, but he didn't invade her space. He simply allowed his presence to exist beside hers, a steadying force that made the moment even more intense. "You don't need to say anything," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know. Your art, your presence, it's been the most meaningful part of my year." Emma swallowed hard, absorbing the weight of his words. She understood in that instant that their connection was more than mentorship, more than admiration. It was an emotional bond built on respect, understanding, and the quiet recognition of each other's humanity. She felt the warmth of vulnerability, the thrill of being truly seen, and the delicate ache of emotions that had been developing silently for months. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge that her feelings had grown beyond simple respect or admiration. She cared for him deeply, but in a way that was complicated, layered, and entirely unspoken. They stood together for a moment, surrounded by the soft glow of gallery lights, the muted chatter of guests, and the quiet hum of the city outside. The painting between them was more than art. It was a symbol of the journey they had shared, a testament to emotional honesty and the subtle power of connection. Emma realized that Adrian's brushstrokes had done more than capture her image, they had revealed her. In all her cautious hope and fragile courage, she felt a surge of gratitude, a recognition that she had grown because he had guided her with patience, respect, and understanding. I see it now," she said softly, her voice steadying. "I see how much I've changed, and I see how much you've helped me grow." Adrian's eyes softened further, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth in her words. "You've given yourself permission to be seen," he replied. "That's the bravest thing any artist can do." The simplicity of his statement struck her. She realized that for months she had been learning not just about art, but about herself, her emotions, her desires, her capacity to connect, and her courage to embrace vulnerability. The gallery continued around them, but in that small corner, time seemed to slow. Emma and Adrian didn't speak for a long moment, allowing the weight of shared experience to settle between them. It was not a confession of love, nor an explicit declaration of affection, but something subtler, more profound. It was understanding, recognition, and emotional intimacy, the quiet realization that they had affected each other in ways neither had anticipated. Emma felt her heart expand, not with fear, but with a warm, steady longing. A sense of possibility that was both thrilling and safe. As the evening drew on, Emma realized that this was a turning point. The gallery, the paintings, the months of mentorship, all of it had led to this moment of recognition and emotional clarity. She understood that her journey was far from over. There were boundaries to respect, challenges to navigate, and emotions to understand. But she no longer felt alone in the process. Adrian's presence, his acknowledgement, And the quiet intimacy of his understanding had given her a sense of courage she had never known before. When the gallery closed and the guests began to leave, Emma felt a calm settle over her. She looked at Adrian one last time, and he met her gaze with the same quiet intensity. There was an unspoken agreement between them, a recognition that their journey was not ending with this night. Their connection, built on months of shared discovery, respect, and emotional honesty, was only beginning to unfold. Emma knew that the feelings she had been nurturing, admiration, longing, and subtle affection, would continue to grow, guided by the same principles of patience, understanding, and emotional depth that had shaped her art. Walking home through the misty Seattle streets, Emma felt the warmth of transformation inside her. She realized that her innocence, once fragile and hidden, had become a source of strength, revealed through her art and through the mentorship of someone who truly saw her. Adrian's brushstrokes had not only transformed her sketches, but had illuminated her own courage, emotional depth, and capacity for connection. She felt ready to face the world, to explore her feelings with care, and to embrace the journey ahead, knowing that the bond she shared with Adrian was a rare and precious one that had shaped her growth, her self-awareness, and her heart. In the quiet of the night, Emma allowed herself a moment of reflection. She understood that her story with Adrian was not about crossing boundaries or forbidden affection. It was about recognition, emotional growth, and the subtle power of human connection.